What can a book on leisure teach our work-centric, productivity-obsessed society about meaning, fulfillment, and freedom? Let's find out. Leisure, it must be clearly understood, is a mental and spiritual attitude. It is not simply the result of external factors. It is not the inevitable result of spare time, a holiday, a weekend, or a vacation. It is, in the first place, an attitude of mind, a condition of the soul, and as such, utterly contrary to the ideal of worker in each and every one of the three aspects under which it was analyzed: work as activity, as toil, and as social function. Compared with the exclusive ideal of work as activity, leisure implies, in the first place, an attitude of non-activity, of inward calm, of silence. It means not being busy, but letting things happen. Leisure is a form of silence, of that silence which is the prerequisite of the apprehension of reality. Only the silent hear, and those who do not remain silent do not hear. Silence, as it is used in this context, does not mean dumbness or noiselessness. It means more nearly that the soul's power to answer to the reality of the world is left undisturbed. For leisure is a receptive attitude of mind, a contemplative attitude, and it is not only the occasion, but also the capacity for steeping oneself in the whole of creation. Leisure is not the attitude of mind of those who actively intervene, but of those who are open to everything, not of those who grab and grab hold, but of those who leave the reins loose and who are free and easy themselves. Almost like a man falling asleep, for one can only fall asleep by letting oneself go. Sleeplessness and the incapacity for leisure are really related to one another in a special sense, and a man at leisure is not unlike a man asleep. Heraclitus the Obscure observed of men who were asleep that they too were busy and active in the happening of the world. When we really let our mind rest contemplatively on a rose in bud, on a child at play, on a divine mystery, we are rested and quickened as though by a dreamless sleep. Or as the book of Job says, God giveth songs in the night. Moreover, it has always been a pious belief that God sends his good gifts and his blessings in sleep. And in the same way, his great, imperishable intuition visits a man in his moment of leisure. It is in these silent and receptive moments that the soul of man is sometimes visited by an awareness of what holds the world together. This is an excerpt from Leisure, the Basis of Culture by Josef Pieper. Who is Josef Pieper? Josef Pieper was born in 1904. He studied philosophy, specifically the Greeks and Thomas Aquinas. He also studied law and sociology and was a professor of philosophy at the University of Munster. Leisure was published in 1952, right after the Second War, which means that he's writing during the time when nations are rebuilding their cities, their towns, and his message in Leisure, the Basis of Culture, is counter to the prevailing view on work and rest at that time, and also is counter to our work-centric, productivity-obsessed culture. And this book, Leisure, is more relevant to us now than it was 60 years ago. The book challenges our contemporary work-centric culture and the idea of total work, where every aspect of our life is dominated by doing more, by this ethos of work and productivity. If you're not being productive in all areas of your life, then you're not living life. Our contemporary mindset is obsessed with filling out every single minute of our calendar, whether that's what time we wake up, how long we meditate for, how long our breakfast should be, how long our focus time should be, how long we should spend with our family, how long we can go out, spend time walking in nature. Everything in our life has to be calculated and put inside of our calendar. And Pieper argues that this shift in our understanding has led to a loss of meaning and a complete neglect of what he calls the liberal arts. And we're going to talk more about this in a bit. And the liberal arts has traditionally been understood as a space for leisure and a place where you cultivate freedom of mind, cultivate the human spirit to become more virtuous. And so he writes, a man who is thus caught up and entangled in the web of every day may still be shaken one day by some profound emotion, whether it comes to him in the form of a philosophical question or a poem or a face. And that quote is addressing this idea that you can only really reflect on this moment and address this profound awakening that happens to you, whether that's through a question, a philosophical question, or a poem that you read, or something that you see in nature, or a face that you see, in your act and participation of leisure. But in our society, we don't understand what leisure is. We've thrown it away. And our modern view of leisure is often seen as a luxury or idleness, right? Something that you do when you're lazy. And work instead has become that central focus. Everything that you do has to be work-oriented, whether that's making more money or becoming a better person so that you can make more money or do more things. And Pieper's point in this book is that leisure is not merely the absence of work or a time of rest, but it's a state of mind characterized by contemplation, of silence, and being open to receiving epiphanies and insights into questions that you're having about life. And the subtitle of this book is The Basis of Culture, meaning that leisure is the basis of having a good human culture. Right? It is that which allows us to live in a society that cares about the things that are actually good, that is not wayward, that is not confused, that understands beauty, that understands truth. But without leisure in a society, we get lost. We fail to understand what it means to be human. We fail to understand what it means to live a meaningful life. And we, most importantly, mistake what freedom means. So Pieper writes, for that very reason, it is of the first importance to see that cultus, which is just culture, now as in the distant past, is the primary source of man's freedom, independence, and immunity within society. Suppress that last sphere of freedom, and freedom itself, and all of our liberties will in the end vanish into thin air. If we have a bad culture, Pieper is saying, we are going to lose our freedom. And this is not just the freedom to do whatever you want, because true freedom is not simply doing whatever it is that you want to do. True freedom is your ability to act rightly, your ability to do what you know is proper, what you know is right, and to have that aligned with your action. That is true freedom. And an example that I always come back to that makes this very clear is when you are training any sort of combative martial arts. And if you're doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and you go against a black belt, somebody who's been training for years and years, and you're bringing a newcomer, right, who has no training whatsoever, and you get both of them to spar each other. The one who is new with no training is free to move his body however he wants to move. He can explode out of positions. He can yank his hand out. He can shove, he can do all sorts of things, but the black belt will always win in that situation because the black belt has control of his body, understands the movements, understands what it is to act, understands the intricate positions that they're in, and is able to act accordingly to the situation. And thus, true freedom in this particular situation is had only by the black belt. Even though the newcomer is free in the sense that he can do whatever he wants, when we're watching this situation, we say that the one who is acting spaz, we call him a spazzy white belt, is not free at all. And so similarly in our lives, true freedom is the man, is the woman who acts in a way that is right, that is proper, and in line with what is good. And this is why I think the quote from Confucius, from the Analects, an episode that we've done, if you haven't listened to it, go check it out. But Confucius has this one line where he says, at 70, I could give my heart and mind free rein without overstepping the boundaries. And his point here is because he's dedicated his whole life into walking in the way, he's able to give his mind and his heart free rein because his mind and his heart are aligned with what is good. That right there is freedom. When we look at our modern attitude to work and leisure, leisure is often seen in our contemporary society as an escape from productivity, as an escape from the busyness of life, right? A time that you take away, a time for vacation, a time for resting our minds by mindlessly scrolling. So Pieper writes, the worker is characterized by three principal traits: an extreme tension of the powers of action, a readiness to suffer in vacuo, unrelated to anything, and complete absorption in the social organism, itself rationally planned to utilitarian ends. Leisure from this point of view appears as something wholly fortuitous and strange, without rhyme or reason, and morally speaking, unseemly. So the first thing to note here is when he says an extreme tension of the powers of action. This is similar to the Henry Nouwen episode that we did, which was the previous one, where Nouwen warns us against being always inclined towards acting and always doing things without proper reflection. And here Pieper is saying the same thing. The worker is characterized by this extreme inclination towards action. And the issue that he takes up with this is that somebody who always acts will oftentimes neglect the reflection, will neglect why it is that he's doing what he is doing or she's doing what she's doing. And Pieper wants to make sure that when you're living your life, you fully understand why it is that you're doing the actions that you're doing, such that you get fulfillment out of it. Otherwise, which we'll go on later on to talk about, he says, you will be under this illusion that society gives, that your life is most fulfilled when you are only working. And he makes a distinction between servile work or servile arts and liberal arts. And the next point in here, when he says, a readiness to suffer in vacuo unrelated to anything. So in the book, he raises this interesting point about our willingness to suffer for no reason whatsoever when we're working. And he says, this readiness to suffer in the vacuum, unrelated to anything, is a deep problem that's embedded in society. And it's embedded in society because people falsely believe that this work that we're doing and our ability to suffer somehow makes all of it more meaningful. And he brings up the point about Sisyphus, who is condemned by the gods to roll up a rock up a mountain, only to have that rock roll back down. And because we live in this nihilistic world, we think, yes, Sisyphus is us. We are that guy who's continually working only to realize that when we get to the top of the mountain, there's more mountains to climb, or in Sisyphus' case, the rock falls back down. And because ultimately it's all meaningless, we somehow have to find meaning in the suffering, unrelated to anything else. And Pieper's point is, this is a false understanding of the human life. You should not suffer simply for the sake of suffering. If you're suffering because it leads you to become more virtuous. But in a nihilistic world, we throw all of this out. The third point that he brings up is, a worker is characterized by a complete absorption in the social organism, itself rationally planned to utilitarian needs, meaning the person is absorbed in the work that they do, in the utility that they are able to provide, in the value that they're able to provide to the society. And because their whole identity is caught up in this provision of value giving to the society, it ends up leaving no room for leisure. And his point is, leisure, from this point of view of a worker, it seems wholly strange and fortuitous. There seems to be no moral reason for actually practicing leisure. And so Pieper goes on to say, in its extreme form, the passion for work, naturally blind to every form of divine worship and often inimical to it, turns abruptly into its contrary, and work becomes a cult, becomes a religion. To work means to pray, Carlyle wrote, and he went on to say that fundamentally all genuine work is religion, and any religion that is not work ought to be left to Brahmins and dancing dervishes. Pieper is witnessing this in Europe, where every nation is rebuilding their cities and towns, and people are obsessed with working. And you can see this extrapolating that to our time now, where we're all obsessed with working. Many of us take pride in how much work we do in a week, how many hours we put in, how many late nights we can clock, how late we stay up in the morning to do the work, how difficult the work is. And Pieper's point is, if you're not careful, work becomes a religion. It becomes a cult. It becomes something that you end up worshiping, even if you are wholly against religions. And like religions, you'll start to create priests. And the priests will be people who do precisely the things that you look up to. They stay up all night working. They clock in 80 hours a week. They do all these things that are considered unhealthy for the mind, for the life of a human being. These work priests are people who are suffering, but in vacuo, as Pieper says. They're suffering unrelated to anything, and they're making their work their end-all and be-all. And they make no room for solitude. They make no room for leisure. And as a result, when the topic about leisure, when this idea about taking time to spend in leisurely activity, for them seems completely strange and wholly unseemly. And on the point about suffering in vacuo, doing hard work as the end-all be-all, he quotes Thomas Aquinas, who writes, "The essence of virtue consists in the good more than in the difficult," meaning the essence of virtue consists in doing quality things, doing what is good, more so than how difficult that thing is. And Pieper goes on to say, "Not everything that is more difficult is necessarily more meritorious. It must be more difficult in such a way that it is at the same time good in a yet higher way." So here you'll notice that the difficulty here is not unrelated to anything else. The difficulty is related insofar as it's more difficult because the good is higher than what was previously more difficult. Pieper calls our society a total work state. So he writes, "The total work state needs the spiritually impoverished one-track mind of the functionary, and he, the functionary, in turn, is naturally inclined to find complete satisfaction in his service and thereby achieve the illusion of a life fulfilled which he acknowledges and willingly accepts." So now he's addressing the prevailing view where people are under the illusion that a life of meaning and purpose is found only in the work itself. But Pieper is saying, look, this is a false reality, because the real beneficiaries of this attitude that the man, the functionary, the woman has is the nation state, right? Is the total work state, not the citizens of the nations. Because when people are spiritually impoverished, when there is no leisure, when there is no solitude, they are easily influenced and inclined to thinking that a life of meaning is found, according to Pieper, in this delusion that work is all that there is. And these people are willingly accepting it. Because as your soul shrinks over time, as you become more and more dedicated to the work, to having less and less leisurely time, as a result, less and less contemplative life, your soul will shrink. And the only thing that benefits is the growth of the nation's GDP. So Pieper is saying this is an illusion that you're living under. But it is very important here to note that Pieper is very careful to stress that work as a general whole is important. Whether that's a plumber, surgeon, a doctor, a lawyer, teacher, electrician, businessman, he's saying these are actually important work, right? And he calls all of this service work. Even if some of these types of work are considered more intellectual, more of a higher status, he says these are all service work. But what he is warning us against is believing and willingly accepting that productivity, the culture of work-centricism, this total work state, he's saying this mindset that it will give you a fulfilled life is not correct, because it will not give you a fulfilled life. And Pieper, being a professor of philosophy, understands very well that in the Western tradition specifically, it is understood by those philosophers that the highest good for a human being is the contemplation of the good. And this is not far off from the Eastern philosophy. We've looked at Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. And Lao Tzu's point is we should spend our life, you and I, reflecting the Tao and allowing the Tao to direct our lives and to live in a state of Wu Wei. And we looked at Confucius, who says very similar things. To live a life of meaning and of purpose is somebody who is reflective and contemplative on their actions, on why is it that they do what they do, and on those who actively have neighbors that they're loving. We looked at the Dhammapada by the Buddha. And in the Dhammapada, what becomes very clear, where he makes the distinctions between the Holy One, the Arhats, and those who are caught up in their passions. And all of this, according to the Buddha, requires somebody who can reflect on their life, can reflect on their actions, can attain enlightenment. I'm already hinting at why leisurely activity and leisure as a whole is going to be important for Pieper. But you can already guess, based on all the episodes that we've done, to attain enlightenment, as Buddha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, it was through the silence, through the meditative practice that he implemented, but more importantly, it was through leisurely activity. Now, returning back to Pieper specifically, Pieper then goes on to make a distinction between the servile arts and the liberal arts, and I've hinted at this already. And this is where these two arts become very important. The Greek philosophers, they were very careful to make this distinction between servile, which is a service art, and liberal arts. And the liberal arts is not simply the liberal arts in modern day universities. It's quite different. But the modern day liberal arts universities are derived from these distinctions. The service arts, or the servile arts, is anything that requires training in the sense of somebody teaching you how to execute a particular function so that that particular function becomes of service to society. It's very utilitarian oriented, right? Be it a carpenter, a surgeon, firefighter, soldiers, business exec, so on and so forth. There's always a utility tied to the thing that you're doing, to the service that you're doing. And as a result, it becomes a servile art. But in our contemporary situation, if you're in a service art, you also have the capacity to and the privilege for leisurely activities. And we'll get into this in just a bit. Historically, for the ancient Greeks, this class divide, which essentially is a class divide, right? Servile arts and the liberal arts are performed by two distinct classes. The servile arts are those things that the servants do. And this is why they do the service work. And the liberal arts, the arts of the free arts, the thing that free men do, are what the aristocrats do. And in ancient Greece, the aristocrats are people who didn't have to work for money. They had estates, they had other means of not working so that they could spend most of their time reflecting, contemplating, doing philosophy. And if you know your history of philosophy well, most of the ancient Greeks were free men. They were not servants. Though some were servants at one point, but then they became free. An example being Epictetus, who was a servant, then he became a free man, and then became a philosopher. Pieper writes, the liberal arts then includes all forms of human activity which are an end in themselves. The servile arts are those which have an end beyond themselves, and more precisely an end which consists in a utilitarian result, attainable in practice and practicable results. And he goes on to say, only those arts are called liberal or free which are concerned with knowledge. Those which are concerned with utilitarian ends that are attained through activity, however, are called servile arts. The reason this distinction is important is because for a human being who is a rational creature, a rational animal, we are inclined towards contemplation. We are inclined towards asking questions that are beyond the tangible. We'll ask questions about what is the meaning of life? Is there a life after death? What is death? What is friendship? What is love? These questions all require that one make and have time to reflect on these things. And that is why for the Greeks, the philosophical questions, the theological questions, the questions around politics, how to run a country, a nation state, are all done by free men. Because the servile arts are done by the servants. Their minds are preoccupied with executing a utilitarian function. And the reason Pieper brings this up is he's saying that we actually live in a society where we have combined these two things together, and now the servile arts are becoming the end-all be-all. But he's saying the servile arts, the service arts, in our modern day, in our contemporary time, actually allows us to spend time in the liberal arts, to do the activities that are concerned with knowledge and that are not concerned with a utilitarian end, to do things that are an end in themselves and not a means to an end. And he calls the liberal arts non-utilitarian modes of human activity. Then he goes on to make this point that leisure is not the same as laziness, and of course, as we've just talked about, it's not the same as service. So he writes, the Middle Ages drew a distinction between the understanding as ratio and the understanding of intellectus. Ratio is the power of discursive, logical thought, of searching and of examination, of abstraction, of definition, and drawing conclusion. Intellectus, on the other hand, is the name for the understanding, insofar as it is the capacity of simplex intuitus, of that simple intuition, of that simple vision to which truth offers itself like a landscape to the eye. Then he writes later on, leisure is where the intellectus is awakened. And it is through leisure that a man becomes educated in this classical sense, where he writes, education concerns the whole man. An educated man is a man with a point of view from which he takes in the whole world. Meaning somebody who cannot be peer pressured into believing certain ideologies simply because other people around them are believing it. And because he's educated, he has convictions on his beliefs. He has convictions as to why he believes these things, and he's willing to act on those things. And this is the distinction between a man who's educated and a man who's trained in a service work. Going further, what is leisure, and why is it so important for Pieper, and why does he think that we should cultivate leisure in our own lives? He writes, Leisure, it must be clearly understood, is a mental and spiritual attitude. It is not simply the result of external factors. It is not the inevitable result of a spare time, a holiday, a weekend, or a vacation. It is, in the first place, an attitude of mind, a condition of the soul, and as such, utterly contrary to the ideal of worker in each of every one of these three aspects under which it was analyzed: work as activity, as toil, and as social function. You're getting to this idea that Pieper thinks that everybody can practice leisurely activities. If not, most people can. At least you and I can. Right? He's saying leisure is a mental and spiritual attitude. This is not the result of external factors. It is not simply spare time, holiday, weekend, vacation, where you're doom scrolling, where you're wasting your time away into doing mind-numbing activities. So he writes, it is also not laziness. And I quote, idleness in the old sense of the word, so far from being synonymous with leisure, is more nearly the inner prerequisite which renders leisure impossible. It might be described as the utter absence of leisure, or the very opposite of leisure. Leisure is only possible when a man is at one with himself, when he acquiesces in his own being, where the essence of acedia, which is laziness, is the refusal to acquiesce in one's own being. Idleness and the incapacity for leisure corresponds with one another. Leisure is the contrary of both. Leisure is not idleness. It's not simply not doing anything, which is a point that Pieper makes throughout the book. Leisure is your capacity to actually do work, even though he's been talking about how we're work obsessed. He's saying leisure is a different type of work. It's a higher form of work. And that's why he's saying it's not idleness, because idleness would simply not be doing anything. And he's saying it's also not laziness, where you refuse to do stuff, where you are afraid to be alone with yourself, so you waste your time away. And he's saying, look, both of these are contrary to leisure. The idea of school, schola, in the Greek, comes from the idea of leisure. So it's not a time to veg out, to turn your brain off. It's rather a time of contemplation. It's a time where you spend it doing things that are intellectually fostering a sense of wonder in you. Right? Whether that's through meditation, whether that's through prayer, whether that's through listening to music, whether that's through doing art or doing any sort of creative activity that are an end in themselves. You're not doing these things for something else. So it is contrary still to this modern understanding of meditation, where within our society, meditation is now seen as a means to an end, right? As a means to becoming more productive at work, as a means to calming our mind, as a means to de-stressing. But truly, meditation, whether that's in the historic proper sense of meditation within Buddhism or within Hinduism, it is an end in itself. You're not meditating for something else. You're doing it simply for the sake of itself. And that is a point that Pieper makes with leisure. He's saying any leisurely activity you do, they have to be an end in themselves, and only through that do you become truly human. And this is why I think this quote, which I mentioned earlier, I like quite a lot. Leisure is a form of silence, of that silence which is the prerequisite of the apprehension of reality. Only the silent hear, and those who do not remain silent do not hear. Silence, as it is used in this context, does not mean dumbness or noiselessness. It means more nearly that the soul's power to answer to the reality of the world is left undisturbed. The previous book I did, Out of Solitude by Henry Nouwen, pairs very well with Pieper's leisure, because Nouwen's point is the importance of solitude, and how solitude is that through which you come to grips with your own existence. It is that through which inspires you to cultivate a genuine care for others, right? To have a truly caring community, he says, can only happen through individuals practicing solitude. And for us, in this situation with Pieper, he's saying, only the silent hear, and leisure is a form of silence. And it is a prerequisite for understanding reality as itself. If you remember the episode we did with Alan Watts, one of the points that Watts makes is this world is an illusion insofar as we think that you and I are two very separate entities and beings that are unconnected. But in truth, we are all connected, because the only thing that exists, according to Watts and a particular strand of Hinduism, is that Brahman is all that exists. And we, Atman, the souls, are in reality, when we reflect and contemplate on what it is that we are, who we are, what is human being, we realize that Atman is Brahman. And I bring this up because for once, the way you get to this realization is through contemplation, is in one sense through leisure, that which Pieper is precisely arguing for. And so then it turns out leisure is an active engagement and recreation of yourself, of your soul, of your mind. It is not this idle sitting around or laziness. Leisure, he writes on page 41, for leisure is a receptive attitude of the mind, a contemplative attitude. True leisure is an end in itself. It's not a means to an end. It's not a means to do something else. And on that same page, Pieper writes, leisure is not the attitude of mind of those who actively intervene, but of those who are open to everything. Not of those who grab and grab hold, but of those who leave the reins loose, and who are free and easy themselves, almost like a man falling asleep. For one can only fall asleep by letting oneself go. Sleeplessness and the incapacity for leisure are really related to one another in a special sense, and a man at leisure is not unlike a man asleep. Such a beautiful paragraph. Pieper here is arguing and stating, more so than arguing, that leisure is like a man who's able to fall asleep. And when you and I think about times when we can't sleep, it is when our mind is restless, right? It is running around. But the times and nights that we can sleep so easily is when we let go, when we are free and easy and leave the reins loose. And that is when we fall asleep. And he's saying leisure is like that. And very specifically, the distinction that we made earlier about the ratio and the intellectus, the rational mind and the intellectual mind. He's saying, look, leisure happens through the intellectual mind. And the intellectual mind, as we saw, is different from the rational mind, because the rational mind is caught up in the logical, in the step-by-step, in the thinking, whereas the intellectual mind simply apprehends things. So he says it's very similar to when you go outside and you look at a scenery. When you see a beautiful scene before you, you apprehend everything at once. You see all the trees at once. You see the mountain, you see the clouds, you see the sunset. You see it all. You don't think logically, okay, here's a tree on the left, then the mountains in the middle, then there's a river here, then there are rocks here, then there are these blades of grass, there are these types of flowers. You see everything at once. And similarly, when you listen to a beautiful music, you hear the music all at once. You don't hear individual notes and you don't follow individual notes. And for Pieper, that essentially is what the intellectual mind does when it practices leisure. When your mind is actively engaged in leisurely activities, you are able to apprehend these things. He says, you're able to understand profound insights. You're able to appreciate the world around you even greater and see that the human life is unfulfilled if it does not have leisurely activities. And the truth for us is there is no real reason why we shouldn't be implementing leisurely activities in our life. Right? We have free time, but free time is not the same as leisurely activities. But free time is what allows you to cultivate leisurely activities. And in my own life, the leisurely practices that I implement and do are things like reading, art, when I'm painting, when I'm meditating, praying, when I have deep philosophical conversations with friends, when I'm obviously doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. What I've found as I was reading this is that because I spend a lot of my time reading and preparing for episodes throughout the week, when I take the day off on Sunday, which is the day of rest for me, where I want to do leisurely activities, I find that if I read, I have this tendency to think about why I'm reading what I'm reading, trying to overanalyzing it and thinking about whether I should be reading this book for another episode. And over the past few weeks, what I've tried to do is when I'm reading a book on Sunday, I try to read it in and of itself. I don't try to think about whether this is going to make me understand some philosophical aspect better, whether it is going to help me understand some political, economic situation better. I simply want to read for the sake of reading. And I think that's very important, and that's something that, reading Pieper solidified in me. The second thing that I find me personally with my leisurely activities is when I am actually practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. On the days that I don't teach and I'm simply training, that I find is a leisurely activity because I'm doing it for the sake of itself. I'm not doing it because I want to get, the upper belt. I want to get more affirmation and confirmation that I'm good from my coaches. I'm simply doing it because I love the grappling art in itself. And I think it's important that you dedicate a time in your week, a full day in your week, where you spend it not doing the things that you normally would do throughout the week. You dedicate it to doing leisurely activities, things that are good for your mind, good for your soul. Because our work allows us to have leisurely activities, as I mentioned before. We're not living in a time when we have to work 7 days a week with no rest at all. Anybody who says that they work 7 days a week with no rest is either a liar or does not know how to sleep. Pieper writes, "The soul of leisure, it can be said, lies in celebration. To rest from work means that time is reserved for divine worship. Certain days and times are set aside and transferred to exclusive property of the gods. Divine worship means the same thing where time is concerned, as the temple where space is concerned. Temple means, as may be seen from the original sense of the word, that a particular piece of ground is specially reserved and marked off from the remainder of the land, which is used either for agriculture or for habitation. And this plot of land is transferred to the estate of the gods. It is neither lived on nor cultivated, and simply in divine worship a certain definite space of time is set aside from working hours and days, a limited time, and specially marked off. And like the space allotted to the temple is not used, is withdrawn from all merely utilitarian ends." In this particular section, what Pieper is talking about is creating a time in your life where you can practice leisurely activities. And he's drawing our eyes to the similarity that exists within a day of rest or Sabbath, where Sunday is taken off to worship God, to do activities that are not quote unquote work, right? Activities that are not service work. And he's saying, just like temple is a piece of ground that is especially reserved, that has been marked off and not used for agriculture or habitation, that is not lived upon, so too you should have a time that is carved out, that you're not doing work, that you're not doing activities that are for something else, but you're doing it simply for leisurely things, simply doing it to cultivate, to contemplate. And as I was thinking about this, I realized that some of the people that we watch, whether those are musicians or athletes or artists, when they are in the moment, when they're sort of in the flow, they do whatever their activity is for the sake of itself, right? They transcend the utility of the game. Yes, if they're playing sports, they have to win. But when an athlete plays for the sake of the game, because they love the game, that's when incredible moments happen. And the truth is, you and I can cultivate the same thing in our lives. It can be in other activities that you do on your leisurely time. And in the middle of the book, there was a point about virtues and how leisure allows you to cultivate virtues. And he talks about how our philosophy post-Immanuel Kant, when asked, what is virtue? The answer is mastering our natural bent, mastering our passionate lower man, as I sometimes say, and being able to control it and subject that passion to the higher man. But Pieper says, and I quote, "What Aquinas says is that virtue makes us perfect by enabling us to follow our natural bent in the right way. In fact, he says that the sublime achievement of moral goodness are characterized by effortlessness, because it is of the essence to spring from love." This connects perfectly to what Confucius says about what the purpose and meaning of life is. And I quote again something from the Analects of Confucius that I've said many times. And it goes, "From 15, my heart and mind was set upon learning. From 30, I took my stance. From 40, I was no longer doubtful. From 50, I realized the propensities of Shen. From 60, my ear was attuned. From 70, I could give my heart and mind free rein without overstepping the boundaries." And you see the similarities between this and what Aquinas says, right? Because for Aquinas, the idea is that virtue is what perfects our nature such that when we act, it becomes effortless. And this is what Confucius says. When he's 70, what my heart and mind desires, he gives them free rein because it becomes effortless in doing what is good. He no longer has to steer it back and forth. He simply does what is good. Pieper quotes Thomas Aquinas, saying, "The reason, however, why the philosopher may be likened to the poet is this: both are concerned with the marvelous. And we can only contemplate on the marvelous and be in a state of wonder and awe when we cultivate leisure in our lives." The challenge for this week is to find a time to carve out where you are resting, but you are doing active rest, active contemplation, where you're not mindlessly scrolling through social media, watching movies, spending time doing things that are work related, but doing things for the sake of itself. Whether that's reading a book for the sake of itself, whether that is going on a walk for the sake of itself, not to get anything, not to achieve anything, and to meditate or to pray for the sake of itself, not to de-stress, not to get enlightened, but simply do it for the sake of itself. And with that, I'll wrap. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you're not already subscribed, do subscribe. And if you haven't give this podcast a rating, do give this podcast a rating, and it helps people find this podcast. And if you have any questions around the episodes or books that I'm doing, feel free to email me at ij@becomingantifragile.com. Peace.